Have you ever experienced that sudden, overwhelming certainty upon meeting someone new? That inexplicable feeling of recognition, of destiny unfolding, of something ancient awakening inside you at the sight of a stranger? You find yourself mysteriously drawn to them, convinced of a connection that transcends the rational, certain that this instantaneous bond represents something profound and meaningful. Society calls this romance, chemistry, or the mythic love at first sight. But the answer lies somewhere deeper, somewhere more unsettling, something that challenges everything we thought we understood about instant attraction. Because when you feel that immediate, overwhelming pull towards someone you've just met, you aren't experiencing destiny. You're witnessing your unconscious recognizing something it knows intimately well. And that recognition doesn't come with fairy tale endings or romantic reassurance. It comes with a profound realization that what we call immediate love often emerges not from health, but from historical wounds, a psychological truth that most people spend their entire lives romanticizing rather than examining. No, you're not magical. You're human. You're not experiencing destiny. You've simply encountered what Freud would recognize as the unconscious identification of a familiar emotional landscape. There's something profoundly revealing about these moments of instant, overwhelming attraction, because that experience shatters our romantic narratives, dismantles our belief in fated connections, and reveals a brutal truth. Most love at first sight isn't about the stranger at all. And most of us are still learning to recognize ourselves in that silent yet deafening mirror of psychological projection. Freud understood that our earliest attachment patterns create templates that we unconsciously seek to recreate throughout our lives. And this mysterious feeling of immediate recognition is actually a manifestation of what he might call transference at work. It's what many experience, but few have the courage to acknowledge. They don't examine the suspicious immediacy of their certainty. They romanticize it. They don't question why a stranger feels so familiar. They're less interested in psychological truth and more in maintaining the intoxicating belief in destined connection. And that makes relationships treacherous because while we believe we're encountering something new and magical, our unconscious has simply recognized someone who fits patterns established long ago through early, often traumatic experiences. The person who experiences love at first sight isn't encountering destiny. They're operating from unconscious recognition, a pattern where attraction isn't random, it's patterned, where chemistry isn't mysterious, it's precise. And maybe that's why it creates such overwhelming emotion, such certainty, such immediate trust in what should reasonably require time to develop. But what many still don't understand is that behind their seemingly magical experience is an unconscious that has identified in this new person the emotional signature of their earliest attachments, often marked by precisely the patterns that created their original wounds. You don't fall instantly in love by accident. Your unconscious recognizes something, and until you understand that recognition, you exist in a state of psychological confusion, mistaking unconscious pattern matching for cosmic alignment. Maybe you don't recognize yourself in this right now. Maybe you think it's cynical, reductive, or an oversimplification of your profound experience. But deep down, way deep down, there's a question inside you. A quiet one that pulses even when you try to ignore it. What if that overwhelming certainty you felt wasn't about destiny, but about recognition? Your unconscious identifying in a stranger the familiar emotional patterns of your earliest, most formative relationships. The mysterious feeling of knowing someone instantly is not magic. It's memory. And those who don't understand Freud's concepts of unconscious recognition and transference often mistake psychological pattern matching for fate throughout their entire lives. But what few people see is that we don't create this immediate certainty consciously. It emerges from templates established in our earliest experiences of attachment, often marked by trauma, inconsistency, or emotional wounding. Freud believed that we unconsciously seek to recreate our original attachment patterns, not despite their painfulness, but often precisely because we're trying to master what once mastered us. And maybe that's why so many still find these instant love connections, ultimately recreating the very emotional scenarios they consciously wish to avoid. Precisely because the unconscious recognition that triggered the initial attraction was identifying patterns similar to those that created their original wounds. While most people claim their instant attractions are about destiny, the unconscious knows they're about recognition. And there, in the midst of what we call magical connection, they've encountered not cosmic alignment, but psychological continuity. Early experiences when attachment became linked with specific emotional dynamics, when their psyche developed templates for what love feels like, often marked by the very inconsistency, intensity, or emotional unavailability that created their original wounds. Their experience of love at first sight didn't develop from mystical connection, but from the unconscious recognition of emotional patterns so deeply familiar that they trigger immediate, overwhelming response. What registered wasn't the actual person, but how that person's demeanor, bearing, subtle cues, and energetic signature activated unconscious templates established long ago. What emerged wasn't magic, but pattern recognition. And that recognition becomes psychologically compelling because it combines the illusion of novelty with the profound familiarity of established emotional pathways. This person knows genuine connection develops over time. They've experienced it. They've had relationships that developed gradually, built on actual knowledge rather than projection. But somehow, those relationships often lack the overwhelming intensity, the certainty, the intoxicating immediacy of what they call love at first sight. And that difference wasn't created randomly. It reflects the distinction between connections built on actual knowing versus those built on unconscious pattern recognition. What registered in their development wasn't just healthy attachment, but often the emotional intensity that comes with traumatic bonding, inconsistent care, or attachment distortions. What emerged wasn't just the capacity for genuine connection, but the neurobiological pathway of mistaking familiarity for safety, even when what's familiar is precisely what created their original wounds. They don't want just any connection. They want the overwhelming certainty that comes with unconscious recognition. They're no longer choosing partners based on actual compatibility, but on the activation of established emotional templates. So maybe that's why their love at first sight experiences so often lead to the recreation of familiar pain, because it's not about the actual person, but the patterns they trigger. And that takes more than surface-level attraction to establish. It takes the subtle, unconscious recognition of specific emotional dynamics, where few are willing to acknowledge that what feels like destiny is actually the precise recreation of their earliest, often traumatic attachment patterns. And that's where many relationships founded on instant connection ultimately falter. Not because fate made a mistake, but because the very recognition that created the initial certainty was identifying patterns similar to those that wounded them originally. They don't want to merely romanticize, they want to understand. Until then, they experience these overwhelming moments not as conscious choice, but as the inevitable activation of psychological templates they didn't create, but inherited from their earliest experiences. This person isn't delusional, they're patterned. There's a vast difference between cosmic alignment and psychological recognition. But the world doesn't easily accept the complexity of this insight. A world that still romanticizes immediate certainty. A world that still celebrates the mysterious knowing that comes with instant attraction as something magical rather than psychological. Freud might suggest that what we call love at first sight is often the unconscious recognition of someone who fits our earliest templates for attachment, even if those templates were formed through trauma. But perhaps our greatest confusion comes not from experiencing this recognition, but from misinterpreting it. And this person's overwhelming certainty upon meeting certain strangers doesn't operate by divine providence. It follows psychological structure. They hear phrases like, "When you know, you know. It was meant to be." Some connections are just immediate. And inwardly, they embrace these romanticized explanations because they're far more appealing than the possibility that what they're experiencing is the unconscious recognition of familiar emotional patterns, often precisely the patterns that created their original wounds. They're not experiencing magic. They're experiencing the activation of established neurobiological pathways, someone who unconsciously triggers the exact emotional templates established in their earliest, often traumatic attachments. And let's be honest, that's not something directed by cosmic forces, but established through psychological development. The overwhelming certainty they feel isn't mysterious, but precisely calibrated. Their psyche identifying in new people the exact emotional signature that matches templates established through their earliest relationships. They're living proof that the unconscious seeks not novelty, but familiarity. And that disrupts our cultural narratives. Destiny feels questionable. Immediate certainty seems less magical. But they aren't experiencing divine orchestration. They're responding to templates formed before they had any concept of their lasting impact. And the powerful feeling of knowing someone immediately is by itself a brutal indicator of how deeply their earliest attachment experiences shape their entire architecture of attraction. This person isn't disingenuous by nature. They don't deliberately romanticize pattern recognition. They understand intellectually the appeal of gradual knowledge-based connection, and for that they carry a double burden, both the overwhelming experience of immediate recognition and the intellectual awareness that what feels like destiny may be trauma recreating itself. They seek meaning in these powerful moments while psychological conditioning pulls them toward people who trigger familiar emotional states. They long for healthy relationships while their attractions reliably lead them toward dynamics that recreate their earliest wounds with almost mathematical precision. And when they meet someone who activates these templates, it's not divine orchestration, it's pattern recognition. When they experience that overwhelming certainty, it's not destiny, it's familiarity, often with precisely the emotional dynamics that created their original wounds. When they find themselves mysteriously drawn to someone within moments of meeting, it's not fate, it's psychological continuity. And that internal battle between romantic narratives and psychological reality is their greatest struggle. Because they don't consciously choose to be overwhelmed by people who fit their traumatic templates. They're driven by unconscious recognition, largely operating beyond awareness. And that divided self, between what they romanticize as destiny and what psychology identifies as pattern recreation, is what makes their experience so difficult to interpret accurately through conscious reflection alone. Perhaps what unsettles people most about this perspective isn't its unromantic nature. It's the uncomfortable truth it reveals about the nature of immediate attraction itself. Freud taught that much of what we attribute to fate is actually the expression of unconscious patterns. But what happens when what we call love at first sight is itself largely the unconscious recognition of emotional dynamics, similar to those that wounded us originally? It was precisely that question that exposes why these immediate, overwhelming connections so often recreate the very painful patterns they claim to transcend. It wasn't by fate. It was a psychological recognition that occurred because the templates for what love feels like were established through early experiences, often marked by precisely the inconsistency, emotional unavailability, or trauma that created their original wounds. They no longer experience these moments through purely romantic narratives. They're beginning to glimpse psychological patterns, and that changes everything. How many times have you wondered why these overwhelming instant connections so often lead back to familiar pain? How many times have you felt that strange sense of knowing someone completely upon just meeting them? This person has felt that too. They once thought these powerful moments represented destiny guiding them toward their perfect match. But one day, they began to question whether what they were experiencing was cosmic orchestration or psychological pattern recognition. And that day, they made the first step toward understanding an experience that had been romanticized, yet repeatedly led them toward the recreation of their original wounds. Their path toward clarity is not a straight line. There are days of romance, moments when destiny feels like the only explanation, nights of wondering why these immediate certainties so often lead to familiar pain. But there's also a growing understanding that illuminates what was once completely mystified. They learned that what they call love at first sight often has very little to do with the actual person at all. The mysterious feeling of immediate recognition is not magic, but precise psychological matching. The overwhelming certainty they experience is not destiny, but the activation of templates established through their earliest relationships. And until that fundamental misinterpretation is corrected, they choose to begin examining rather than simply romanticizing these powerful moments. Not out of cynicism, but out of the necessity for psychological honesty. This person is the living embodiment of Freud's insight that much of what we experience as spontaneous is actually the expression of deeply embedded patterns. They've been shaped by early attachment experiences, often marked by trauma or inconsistency, formed by emotional templates that permanently established what love feels like, pulled by unconscious recognition so powerful that it creates the overwhelming experience of knowing someone upon first meeting. And now that they're beginning to recognize the pattern, they face the monumental task of separating romantic narratives from psychological reality. They don't want just to romanticize these powerful experiences. They want to understand how they often lead to the recreation of familiar wounds. That's challenging because it requires not just intellectual understanding, but psychological honesty. And sadly, few undertake this difficult journey. Most still mistake unconscious pattern recognition for destiny, psychological continuity for cosmic alignment, the recreation of traumatic attachment for fated connection. And if they still experience moments of overwhelming certainty upon meeting specific strangers today, it's because every instance activates templates established long ago. Every experience of love at first sight they feel is an unconscious recognition of familiar emotional patterns. Every immediate certainty they encounter follows trajectories established through their earliest relationships. They're beginning to see the pattern without yet knowing how to transcend it. And that awareness born from honest self-observation transforms their relationship to these powerful experiences. Because a person who has glimpsed the psychological reality behind what they thought was destiny becomes awakened. Not because the pattern immediately changes, but because they've begun to see what was previously romanticized. The person who experiences love at first sight is not encountering cosmic orchestration. Something inside them is recognizing patterns established long ago. And it was precisely those patterns that created both their overwhelming certainty and the potential for their eventual understanding. Because sometimes only in recognizing psychological reality can we begin the long process of genuine choice. Freud suggested that bringing unconscious patterns into consciousness is the beginning of psychological freedom. And that's exactly what they've begun to undertake. They're reconnecting with how their earliest attachment experiences established templates for what love feels like. Facing the reality of how profoundly those early relationships, often marked by trauma or inconsistency, shaped what triggers their immediate, overwhelming attraction to specific strangers. They disrupted romantic narratives by making them conscious. They began questioning what they thought was destiny, not by becoming cynical, but by becoming psychologically honest. They learned that their experiences of love at first sight weren't cosmic orchestration, but unconscious recognition of familiar emotional patterns, often precisely the patterns that created their original wounds. And when they stopped simply romanticizing these powerful moments, they began the more nuanced work of truly seeing the pattern clearly. First with resistance, then with recognition, and finally with the clarity necessary for any genuine transformation. Because someone who has seen the psychological reality behind what they call destiny no longer mistakes pattern recreation for cosmic alignment quite so unconsciously. They learn to notice when they're experiencing unconscious recognition, to honor the reality of their overwhelming response while not being completely controlled by it. They're not instantly transformed, they simply no longer act completely unconsciously. There's a world of difference between blind romanticization and experience observed with growing awareness. They still feel the powerful pull towards certain strangers, yes, but they've begun to recognize it as pattern activation rather than destiny. Not with self-judgment or harsh criticism, but with the curious attention of someone who genuinely wants to understand rather than simply continue recreating familiar wounds. Their awareness has become an ally rather than an enemy. Their recognition is a new capacity. They can begin to distinguish between unconscious pattern recreation and genuine connection. And they don't hesitate to question what once seemed like the mysterious, ineffable nature of love at first sight itself. Their transformation isn't immediate. It's gradual. It's as if they've tapped into an ancient understanding, an old wisdom that humans aren't destined to blindly recreate their earliest wounds, but can, through awareness, begin to make more conscious choices, not to deny the power of unconscious recognition, but to understand its origins and implications. And in accessing that understanding, something awakens in them, a psychological freedom, emotional maturity, a person who, though still susceptible to these powerful experiences, is no longer completely mystified by them. They're in communion with something greater, with the possibility of choice beyond pattern recreation. And no matter how deeply established their templates from early attachment, nothing remains completely romanticized when illuminated by genuine self-awareness. They no longer simply follow their overwhelming attractions blindly. They observe them with growing clarity. They're no longer helplessly recreating their earliest wounds without understanding the process. They do the psychological work. And that shift from unconscious romanticization to conscious recognition changes everything about their relationship to these powerful experiences. But they're no longer identified completely with their patterns. They've already begun to see beyond them. And in that seeing, they discovered that genuine connection might feel completely different from the familiar intensity of unconscious recognition, less overwhelming, but more authentic, less immediate, but more sustainable. There's something profound about the way they now approach these powerful moments. They don't need to deny their reality. Their awareness is expanding, and it's in that expansion that their true freedom lives. Freud might say that bringing the unconscious into consciousness doesn't eliminate its power, but allows us to relate to it differently. And perhaps that's why this person, in choosing to understand, rather than simply romanticize, has become someone capable of eventually making choices beyond the blind recreation of their earliest attachment wounds. They no longer try to simply mythologize their immediate certainties or convince anyone that their overwhelming attractions represent cosmic orchestration. They don't deny the reality of their powerful experiences, because they've learned that psychological patterns transform, not through romanticization but through recognition. And when they feel that familiar, overwhelming pull towards someone they've just met, they now pause. They don't engage in magical thinking or fatalistic surrender. They observe with the dignity of someone who's followed this pattern enough times to recognize its signature. What few people understand is that this person still experiences genuine attraction. They still feel the powerful immediacy, the recognition, the overwhelming certainty with specific strangers. But they want to understand these experiences through psychological reality rather than romantic mythology, with honest awareness rather than mystical interpretation, with the courage to recognize when they're potentially being drawn toward the recreation of their earliest wounds. Now they only offer themselves where there's the possibility for genuine connection beyond pattern recreation. And that requires a level of maturity that goes far beyond conventional romance. It requires self-awareness. It requires having faced one's own psychological patterns and still choosing to evolve beyond them. They're not looking for perfection. They're looking for authenticity, a connection that might not overwhelm them immediately, but that offers the possibility of something beyond the recreation of familiar wounds, where both can relate to each other as actual individuals rather than unconscious projections or activations of templates established through early trauma. And if that seems less magical than the intoxicating certainty they've known, perhaps that's precisely the point. Because they'd rather find genuine connection than continue mistaking trauma recreation for destiny. And to many still caught in unconscious pattern matching, that sounds like settling for less intensity. But it's really just psychological freedom in its purest form. If something inside you was touched by this exploration, maybe it's because deep down you too are ready to examine the psychological reality behind your experiences of love at first sight. A reality that begins with honoring the power of unconscious recognition. A relationship with yourself that acknowledges both the overwhelming nature of these experiences and their potential origins in your earliest attachment patterns. A clarity that can't be achieved through romanticization alone, but must emerge from increasing psychological honesty. And if that clarity hasn't fully arrived yet, maybe it's because you first needed to recognize that what feels like cosmic orchestration might actually be the precise recreation of templates established through your earliest relationships, something worth understanding rather than simply mythologizing. And if this message found you at the right moment, or awakened something you forgot was living inside you, then share it with others who might be silently questioning why their most powerful, immediate attractions so often lead to the recreation of familiar pain. Because when something illuminates the soul, the least we can do is let it keep shining within us and through us.